Hello, everyone. I'm hoping everyone can see and hear me. I just wanted to go ahead and kick off our FinOps on Azure webinar. So today, hosting our webinar is Josh Garverick. He is our cloud solutions architect and a great addition to our team. So I'm just going to bring him on in here, and I'll go ahead and give it to you, Josh.
Very good. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Appreciate you taking a little bit of time to go through this quick webinar on the wonders of FinOps on Azure and how to bring cost control to your cloud real estate. A lot of folks are probably wondering what exactly is FinOps, and it really boils down to a data-driven approach that allows you to manage costs in the cloud. It allows you to actually incorporate strategies and technologies that will help you track and optimize spend, as well as ultimately deliver value to your end users in a much more efficient way. You may be surprised to know that cost management is now more of a concern than security when it comes to cloud resources. Folks are becoming more comfortable with the overall idea of cloud security, but still have problems actually finding out how to calculate costs on what's being used, who's using it, does it need to be used as much as it is being used, things like that. So some interesting statistics here at the bottom around the overall interest level that folks have in actually going through and getting a better handle on what they're spending and how to better rationalize that from a business perspective. We hear a lot of things out in the market and talking with different folks. A lot of the same challenges continue to keep coming up. Who's responsible for our overall cloud spend? Who actually manages that? Which teams are using applications? And how are they using those applications? What's the return on investment for a specifically expensive cloud service? Are we maximizing our usage on this? Is it worth our time? Is it worth our money? Should I spend more to find out if I can run this on a cheaper service? So looking at things from the perspective of, is this service sized correctly for the workload that you're trying to get out there? Sometimes it's a matter of being overwhelmed with choices. Why are there 3 different options to solve this problem on the same cloud platform? And why are they priced differently? And why do they do different things? So there are a lot of different types of challenges that we hear out there. And really what it boils down to is taking a more calculated approach to how we manage FinOps and manage cloud cost. And that's really by starting with a FinOps mindset. We look at it holistically. There are kind of 3 major buckets that this falls into. And this somewhat aligns, although not directly, but somewhat aligns with the FinOps Foundation's crawl, walk, run methodology for getting to the point where you have a good handle on how to control cost, how to communicate that cost, and how to help folks hold each other accountable to keeping costs in line. We'll talk about each one of these items in a little bit more detail, beginning with the Get Started section, which is going to be some things that you can implement and use pretty much right away to give you some visibility into what's going on from a spend perspective. We'll move then into getting more organized. So using Azure Policy to help contain cost and limit what can and can't be deployed to make sure that things are within certain parameters. Then we'll talk about being proactive and planning further resource usage. So things like reserved instances and spot instances, for example. We'll talk a little bit more about those as well. So let's get started. First up is Azure Advisor. And for anyone who is not aware, this is something that is built into Azure that allows you to basically run a scan, and it will come back with recommendations that align with the 5 pillars of the well-architected framework as written by Microsoft. A lot of this comes back with information around right sizing of resources. So you may be able to see in the screenshot here, while this is sample information, a lot of it comes back on virtual machines and other services that maybe aren't utilized to the fullest extent that they could be. You have the ability also to set up auto remediation to take care of these things, which is basically a fancy way of saying setting up some automation to go out and take care of a specific type of right sizing activity in a repeatable way. And while that is something that a lot of folks like to look to help remove the manual interaction from all of this, I would also caution to tread lightly. Sometimes those scripts can produce unintended results and may run on groups or machines that perhaps you don't want them to. So be sure that when you're putting those things in place, that you're thoroughly testing and making sure that only the resources impacted are the ones being right-sized or auto-remediated. Budgets is another great one, and this is, again, built into Azure. You can go through at the management group, subscription, or resource group level and set up budgets that specifically will allow tracking of cloud spend based on a certain number that you put in. So, for example, if you have 10 development teams and each development team has a monthly quota or allowance of $200, you can create a monthly recurring budget of $200 and then create alerts on top of that to have notifications sent if things are getting close to that cap. This will not actually shut things off for you, though. This is more of a reactionary type control where you're putting this in place and then you're alerted if things are getting close to being over budget. But it does help to provide some transparency as well as communicate to folks when things are getting a little bit too expensive. Cost monitoring and alerting is also built in. I mentioned that you can set up alerts based on specific thresholds, how close you're getting to your budget. These are all things that can be set up very granular or very coarse grained. It really depends on what you're after. I mean, you could set something up where, as you see on screen here, as soon as it hits 80%, every 5% that's spent above that gets an alert. You might do a 75, 85, 95 type of split. It's really up to the level of tracking that you want to enable and you want to have visibility into. Now that we've gotten things started, let's get a little bit more organized. As we were talking about things earlier, we mentioned that Azure policy is one way to help kind of steer things towards a common ground when it comes to what resources can and can't be used in specific subscriptions or even overall in your organization's cloud estate. One of the larger areas where this comes in handy is through SKU limitations, and that's related mostly to virtual machines, but can also be related to things like app services, SQL, Azure SQL, a number of other data services where different service tiers or SKUs are actually involved. Deploying these policies, and again, these can be deployed at the management group level, the subscription level or the resource group level, deploying these at certain levels allows you to control a greater surface area and ensure that only things that are deemed to be approved can actually be deployed. Tagging. This is one that I feel is kind of a no-brainer, but a lot of folks don't necessarily get into the weeds too much on tagging their resources. And specifically for tracking cost, it's critical to make sure that you're tagging your resources with things that are meaningful. Meaning, put information in those tags that allows you to separate information into groups and reports that make sense to people. So a common list of things that you may see in tags for tracking cost would be the cost center. Sometimes the department name will show up in there, the business owner, as well as the technical owner, so that there's some traceability on who's accountable for these specific resources. But the big one is cost center, and a lot of folks use that to enable chargebacks or showbacks to different departments on what's being used, what some of the forecasting looks like, how to better plan and budget for future cloud use as well. So tagging is one of probably the most important baseline things to get right out of the gate. Another area that folks don't necessarily start off looking at is what I call utilization profiles. And this is around having an understanding of what resources you're using in the cloud and how long they actually have to be available for. Now, in some cases, i.e. production environments, you're going to have things that are going to be on 24/7, 365. For your dev and your test environments, however, you might not need that level of uptime for those resources. You may only need those things turned on, during normal business hours. Or maybe there's a specific team that uses that environment off hours. So on an overnight shift or something like that, there are ways to set up timings so that you can either run automation to automatically turn on or turn off those resources. Or in some cases, like with DevTest Labs, that is built in. You just merely need to set the parameters on start time and shutdown time. Now, this is not just relegated to virtual machines. This can also be used on other services that allow you to stop completely. For example, AKS, Azure Kubernetes Service, you can actually stop the cluster and you will not be charged for ongoing compute. You will only be charged for any storage that's associated with that cluster. App services, another area. You can actually stop app services as well. So that there are ways to kind of control that cost too. There are obviously other models that can be looked at, things like consumption plans versus running resources all the time. So as a request comes in or a job is submitted, it only runs when something is asking it to run. So there are ways to work that into your utilization profile as well. Well, we got started. We got a little bit more organized. Now we can actually take a look at getting proactive on managing spend. A big area where this tends to land with folks and resonate pretty well is in the area of reserved instances. And this goes more towards your capacity planning, your forecasting, your budgeting. A lot of times that's very directly related to workloads based on virtual machines. However, there's a lot that you can save if you go out and actually reserve compute for a long period of time. So if you have an application that you know is going to be required to run on a virtual machine because the vendor who originally wrote the application only supports it being installed on a virtual machine. There are a lot of third-party tools and platforms that are in that boat. If you know that you're going to be using that product for 1 year, 3 years down the road, it would make a lot of sense to look at using reserved instances to save yourself money. And you can see the source as well as the diagram here that gives you a little bit of a comparison between your ongoing pay-as-you-go type of plan for compute versus using reserved instances. And then on the very right, you see that also coupled with the Azure hybrid benefit, which we'll talk about in a moment. And that can really add up to a lot of money saved on those specific workloads. For the hybrid use benefit, some folks may know it as AHub. It basically allows you to reuse licenses that you have for Windows and for SQL Server when actually installing those things onto cloud resources, virtual machines, in Azure. Now, this does assume that your organization has a software assurance plan with Microsoft, meaning there's a license and procurement management system in place with Microsoft to ensure that your number of licenses for Windows and SQL Server are accounted for and all that good stuff. When you're going to actually deploy a workload that can use Azure Hybrid Use Benefit, there's a checkbox there that says, essentially, I certify that I have the appropriate license for this, and it will work the savings into that price for you. Now, again, that's assuming that you do have that software assurance plan. And if you don't, there are usually points in time when things will be reconciled to check whether or not those licenses do actually exist under a software assurance plan, or if they need to be charged at retail. So there are catch-up periods where folks may see that if they don't have the appropriate plan in place. So it's something to keep in mind when attempting to use that, just to make sure that you have that type of agreement with Microsoft on the licenses itself. As we all know, licensing can be a complicated and sometimes frustrating part of technology operations, and this is no different. But it is something that can save you money. Another alternative, especially in areas where you may be doing custom development with .NET, anything past .NET Core will run on Linux or on Windows. And you tend to not see the license implication with Linux for things like Ubuntu, Debian, those types of distributions, anything that's not like a Red Hat Enterprise license or anything like that. Those can save you money too. So just something additional to keep in mind. If it doesn't require Windows specifically, you may be able to switch operating systems to Linux, run your workload, and save yourself about 25% on the overall cost of that VM or that service. Spot instances. This is another area that I think is somewhat underutilized. I don't hear it talked about as much as things like reserved instances, but this allows you to basically purchase unused compute that is in Azure data centers currently, with the understanding that at some point that workload that you're running may get evicted to provide compute for another resource. There's a couple of different parameters that you can set for that. One is a maximum price. So if a specific workload gets up to a threshold cost, you can have it turn off and self-evict and basically return those compute resources back to the pool. This is available for both VMs and for VM scale sets. Some folks may use these types of instances for dev environment machines that are running fairly small time-boxed jobs or scopes of work. I've also seen this used in node pools for AKS, where folks are looking to gain a little bit more back in terms of savings on what they're trying to execute, but also at least give some flexibility in that compute power for lower environments when you may have the ability to have some of those things interrupted and not impact performance or impact user sentiment or anything like that. So we talked about a lot of different areas, and one thing that I would like to go into a little bit more would be what's next. So you got yourself started, you got organized, you're thinking proactively about how to better manage these costs, but what else can be done? And one thing that we do tend to see a lot of success with is actually having folks go through a FinOps assessment. And this allows us to help you identify areas that can save you money pretty quickly. So those low-hanging fruit areas, quick wins, and things like that. Moving into resource optimization from there, helping folks understand how best to do that and where it makes sense. Enabling visibility and control over how things are spent, who gets to see the information, who needs to see the information, and how is it relevant to their overall KPIs and targets. And then that rounds out into a more optimized steady state that allows you to set things up confidently, knowing that cost control is in place and that it's a bit more predictable as opposed to having widely varied costs for different services or a surprise charge for one service that perhaps you weren't anticipating. To give you a little bit more insight, this is kind of the structure of how we tend to operate with our FinOps assessments. And this gives us the ability to not only meet with folks, but also go through each one of those areas, establish recommendations, actually help to implement those recommendations, and help to understand what it means to have your steady state running with those types of controls in place. And with that, I would like to say thanks for listening. Much appreciated. Hopefully there were some bits of information in here that were new to you and you can walk away with a little bit more knowledge than you started with. I am actually done with my presentation. So if anyone has any questions, now is a great time to start asking. Do we have any questions out there? Kim, are you seeing anything?
Yes. Michelle asked, could you elaborate on the role of tagging in Azure for cost allocation, show back and charge back, and how our services streamline this process for maximum efficiency?
Sure. So I'll start with the first part of that, which is how tagging actually contributes to that. The way the information is organized, you can either through the use of tools like Power BI or through applications like Cloud Health is one that can be used as well to help give that visibility. But there has to be something that you aggregate on, some sort of a data point or a data value that says, hey, everything that rolls up and has this tag should be aggregated into a lump sum so that we can see it. Normally, that's where your cost center or your department ID or something of that nature that helps denote a group, a sub-organization, a division, any of those things that helps group those costs together in a way that helps folks understand, here we are at the higher level. This is what's being spent. Going down further, you may have team IDs or other things that help further break that cost down. But when you're looking to work with that data, not only the billing data, but also the generic resource data that comes out of Azure that gives you, resource name, their tags, and things like that. It looks to use tags as a means of grouping that information and aggregating those cost values. So you get benefit out of putting that stuff into your tags and actually making sure that things are appropriately aligned, that you're not allocating resources to another department, accidentally. And the best way to incorporate that into your overall landscape and your overall SDLC is to have those values populated when things are being deployed. So for example, if you have an infrastructure as code repository that deploys an app service for a web app that one team is working on, one of the parameters that can go into that code is the actual cost center or department ID. And that can be turned into a tag that is then put on that resource group, those specific resources automatically. So there's not even something that you need to go in manually and add these things. Do it in code, do it up front. And that'll make sure that things are appropriately tagged, but also ready to be consumed when it comes to looking at those cost reports and things like that. So hopefully that answers that question.
Any additional questions? Thank you, Michelle, for your question. If we have no more questions, I just want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. At any time, you can go ahead and email salesus@experit.com. I put that information in the chat. If you have any questions or need any additional help in this area, this video will also be up on our YouTube channel as well on our event landing page. So you can find it in both those places as well. But thank you so much for joining, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thanks so much.